Hello, welcome everyone. Tonight's program is brought to you by Save Ellis Island, Inc., and we are the nonprofit partner of the National Park Service for the restoration and reuse of the 29 historic hospital buildings on Ellis Island's south side. To learn more about Save Ellis Island and the work being done to preserve this national icon, visit www.saveellisisland.org. My name is Bonnie Lynn Niedzika, and I work for Save Ellis Island, and I will be your host for this evening. And we're really happy to have with us Nicole Gregory. She's the author of God's Messenger, The Astounding Achievements of Mother Frances X. Cabrini, a novel based on the life of Mother Cabrini, as well as several other biographies about early Christian missionaries from Italy. She also works as a freelance book editor, editing memoirs and other nonfiction books for authors around the country. Nicole has been a staff editor at the Orange County Register, Family Circle, rest in peace Family Circle magazine, Vegetarian Times, and many other publications. She has also written features for Los Angeles Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, and Good Housekeeping magazine, among others. Nicole lives in Los Angeles, and in her free time, she enjoys painting, reading novels, and hiking with her husband and son. We are so happy that Nicole is joining us tonight. As we go along, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat, and we will be taking questions at the end. So, welcome, Nicole.
Nice to be here. Nice to see you, Bonnie.
So, question number one, what inspired you to write about Mother Cabrini?
Well, I was actually asked to write this book by Robert Barbera, who's the founder of the Mentores Project books. But as soon as I started diving in and learning a little bit more about her, I found her to be incredible, and I was inspired by her. She was a fierce advocate for immigrants. She very much believed in education for girls, and also teaching girls skills that they could use and make money with. She stood up to male leaders in the church and wouldn't let them stop her when she had an idea for a project that would help some immigrants, Italian immigrants. And also she really advocated for poor people. She was very tuned into the needs of poor people all around the world. I would say also she was brave. She was petite, and she was ill a lot of her life. She was petite her whole life, but she was ill a lot. Yet she crossed the ocean 24 times. As I know you know, she crossed the Andes. She was physically very brave, and I found her very inspiring.
Ooh, the Andes, that chapter was a little hair-raising. So in order to write this book, how did you go about researching background for it? You include a lot of excerpts from her many letters, so you're really giving us her viewpoint. Is there an archive with papers related to her? Where is the material available? Where do you find out about Mother Cabrini?
You know, it's not easy to find her archives. I think a lot of them are in Italy, where she started her first institutions. But and there are many books written about her today that have relied on those archives. And the first biography that was written about her was written by a secretary of hers who, she died in 1917, but the secretary about 10 or 11 years later wrote a book about her life. And that's considered the best source for the story of her life. And I relied on that. And then a book that contained her journals from her many ocean voyages, because she was a prolific letter writer, and she was a prolific journal keeper. And when she was on these long voyages, she often wrote about her faith. She would often speak directly to God and to Jesus. And so it's kind of it was a good way for me to kind of see how she thought and how she felt and how she formed her spiritual life. And she had tremendous faith. I mean, she just really relied on God, probably more than anybody I've ever read about before. And through thick and thin, and on these early voyages across the ocean, there were treacherous times when I think everybody thought they were about to die, and she always turned to God in those times.
Yeah, if you want to count folks of ocean voyage at that time period, Charles Dickens did one, and it's a doozy about crossing the Atlantic. It really was not for the faint of heart. And the letter writing just amazes me because the more she did and the more she traveled, her circle just kept getting bigger. So, I mean, I can't imagine what her address book looked like.
It's true. And when you think about it, I mean, she had to send letters to her, missionary sisters in South America, Central America, New York, Denver. She was writing to them all over the place. And yet it would take sometimes years for the letters to arrive. So she would write her feelings about what she was hoping for them, and she was trying to give them courage to keep going. And everywhere they went, these young women who were sisters encountered all kinds of trouble. They got sick too. They were poor. They had very little money to start doing the work that they were doing, and so she wrote a lot to encourage them and to just give them the sort of spiritual strength to keep going.
So speaking of all those folks that she wrote to, she actually founded an order. She founded the Order of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Is the order still active today?
Yes, it is. It's apparently all over the world in about 16 or 17 different countries. And I think they also, wisely have partnered with some nonprofits to do the work that they do. But they are alive and well, and you can find them on the internet and see what they're up to.
Even Mother Cabrini with her God connection probably couldn't have imagined the internet, nuns on the internet. I think one of the things too that really struck me reading the book, people today kind of have this, when you say missionary, I have this idea in my head of, Dr. Livingston, trekking across Africa. And, but she began her missionary work in the United States. Her first place she went was New York City. So what was the impetus for her to go to New York City?
Well, she actually first was in Italy for a long time, and she started different institutions or foundations, she called them, in different parts of Italy. And so her real goal, though, was to go to China. And I've learned by writing a couple of books about these early Italian missionaries is that a lot of them wanted to go to China because they saw it as a godless place. And they felt very impassioned about bringing Jesus and Christianity to these godless people. And she had encountered a missionary when she was a girl, and she was inspired by him, and she had that goal. But along the way, she heard about the plight of particularly Italian men who left Italy to go to the United States hoping to find work. And they were poor in Italy, and they were going to New York to find work that they believed was there. And a lot of times they were tricked by these so-called agents who would have them pay for, it still happens today, obviously. People who want to leave their countries can be easily tricked by, other people who take their money, and then, they're left to the perils of their journey and what happens when they get there. So she heard about this happening to Italians, and she was really struck that these were her country people, these were her neighbors, these were her relatives, these were her, fellow Italians, and that this shouldn't be happening. And I think she had a very strong sense of justice, and that, poor people were so often taken advantage of, and she really wanted to try and stop that.
So what was life like for those Italian immigrants in New York at that time? Where were they living? What were they working?
Well, when they got to New York, and I'm sure you've heard of the book, How the Other Half Lives, it was squalor. They were at the bottom rung of society. The men were given the most dangerous jobs, which was to build tunnels, subway tunnels. And, there was no job safety department. And people lived in tenements, and The diseases swept through the tenements, and so children were left with no parents, and they would toddle around the street, left, and women died in childbirth. And really, what was so astounding about New York at that time is, say in Midtown, it was, and the Upper East Side, Upper West Side, these beautiful grand houses, townhouses and buildings, stone buildings. And in Lower Manhattan, it was just utter squalor. And some people, like Mother Cabrini, when she saw that, she couldn't reconcile it, and it just outraged her. And so she wanted to stop that. So she wanted people to be able to be tended by doctors, or tended by herself and her sisters. And she wanted to give them the opportunity to acknowledge Italian holidays, and Italian do traditional things like celebrate the feast days. And the other worry that she had, and so did the Italians, so did the Catholics in Italy, was that the Presbyterian Church, the Protestant churches in the United States were established a little earlier. And so some of these Catholic families who were so destitute were being attracted to the Protestant churches, and that was considered the worst thing that could have happened to them. So that was another reason why priests and nuns were sent from Italy to come to New York.
Yeah. Wow. I think it's just hard to wrap our brains around what it was like today, or back in those days. And that part makes me chuckle, because my mother is a Protestant who married a Catholic, and it was
Mhm.
like a really big fat hairy deal for the Protestant side of the family. So it's always funny, because it doesn't matter. We're always, whether or not it's groups in Christianity or different nationalities, we're always putting the other out there.
True.
Actually, next, I believe you were going to read a passage from
Yeah, so
Devout.
what you brought up is really a critical point in Mother Cabrini's story, because she had this romantic notion of going to China. China is like a big unknown, but she also, like, her number one hero was Francis Xavier, and he went to China, and a couple of early missionaries went to China and Japan, and they were very much revered, and they sacrificed. I mean, they died there, and so she wanted to follow that path. It was a very romantic, in my mind, extremely romantic notion based on very little reality of what it would have been like. So the turning point was when she realized that her real call was from the United States. And that was pretty critical, because that was a complete reversal of direction and actually purpose. So I wrote about that moment. And at the time, right before she went to New York, she was pretty much preoccupied with expanding her foundations as far around Italy as she could, meaning, bringing young women in to be sisters in her order, so that they could start doing the work of starting schools and starting orphanages and things like that. So she was pretty much concerned about starting one in Rome, and she did. And that was considered a big success to her. And she met with a bishop who wanted to talk to her about something, and she really didn't want to, but she knew how to play the game. She had to appease people above her, so she agreed to meet this guy. So this is what I'm going to read about this moment. At the suggestion of Bishop Bonamelli, Bishops Scalabrini and Mother Cabrini agreed to meet in Rome in November of 1887, soon after her foundation had been established there. Neither looked forward to seeing the other. They were both busy and had much to do, but out of politeness, they finally agreed to meet at the Trevi Fountain. As soon as they spotted one another on a windy day at the fountain among the tourists, they greeted each other amiably and settled down in a cafe next to the gentle splashing of the fountain. As soon as the pleasantries were over, Scalabrini launched into the shocking details of what happened to most of the poor Italian men and women who were arriving in America. Rampant illness, malnourishment, filthy apartments shared by multiple families, orphaned children left to fend for themselves. I've sent some of my priests to establish foundations, but much more help is needed for these Italians and their families there, he said, his dark eyes flashing with a mixture of anger, anxiety, and sadness. Something about him reminded Mother Cabrini of the missionary she had heard long ago, standing on a box in St. Angelo. There was a great and critical need, Scalabrini was saying, a need for missionary work in this far-off land. He made the case to her. No one can stop people from emigrating. Their lives are hard here, and they naturally want to seek out something better. So the answer is that the Catholic Church should be in those foreign cities to welcome and care for the Italian immigrants. Surely this is God's will, he said. His eyes glittered intensely, and Cabrini clearly understood the urgency of the situation he described. Tell me, she said to him, why do you not go there yourself? I have more influence here in Italy, he said. I've sent priests to New York who have a small church from which they can help the poor. But I need to be in touch with Italians here who can influence religious and political men in America who are in a position to provide real help. As the two walked away through the narrow streets of Rome, they exchanged ideas about how to save the bodies and souls of their fellow countrymen. Surely education was imperative, but what about food and medicine? Someone had to appeal to the government, the church, even wealthy Italians for help. There's no time to waste, Scalabrini said. We have to work as quickly as we can. The meeting left Cabrini's mind swirling. Her heart had been set on China for so many years, but how could she ignore her own countrymen? So soon after that, she went to New York, and there she encountered the Catholic priests who really were not interested in helping her. And
they wouldn't even give them a place to stay, right? I mean, they sent them to the Roach Motel down the street, pretty much.
Exactly. In Lower Manhattan, they got to stay in a Roach Motel. And, ultimately who really did help them were other orders of nuns who were there. Even just a few of them would share their food, share their place to sleep. So, it's a kind of a feminist story. It really is. And another thing that I liked about Mother Cabrini, the more I learned about her, is that she really was kind of she lived outside of the social norms for women of that time. And doing that gave her a really nice perspective and a real independence. And she was a really independent thinker. And so I think she knew that if she had stayed in Italy and, married a farmer, she would never have been able to travel. She would never have been able to do anything creative or anything helpful to the world.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't afraid to take on the Pope, which it's very interesting. Obviously, access to the Pope was much easier back then. Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind for our audience, that was in the 1880s, and Ellis Island did not open until 1892. So, you can't even think of these people as being the ones who kind of came through Ellis Island and got on trains and went to places with jobs. These were people that literally got off the boat and kind of stumbled, their way through things.
Maybe they got checked by a doctor. Maybe they didn't. It's hard. I've read it both ways, so I don't really know.
Yeah. So it's if you're picturing the Great Hall, that's not these folks.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that really struck me about Mother Cabrini, and I think you've touched on it quite a bit, is the fact that she does not fit in with some stereotypes that people have as nuns. I mean, I was raised in a Catholic family, and there's sort of the image of this strict Catholic school teacher with the ruler in hand. Or this idea that they're kind of just not really part of the world. They're just kind of living on this other spiritual plane. But she wasn't any of those things. She was a savvy businesswoman. I think she was just as savvy as some of the robber barons that were going on. I mean, if you just look at what she managed to accomplish, it was amazing. Growing up in the small town in Italy, because you do talk a lot in the beginning of the book, you give a really nice picture of her upbringing, which is a good juxtaposition from where she grew up to where she wound up traveling to. How do you think she came by these abilities?
Well, I think part of it is that her parents believed in education. Even though they were farmers, they believed in education. And so they sent her to school. And in school, she loved school. She loved education. And I think she saw right away the value of education for girls, that being somewhat educated set them on a better path. So she understood the value of education. I think also there was a lot of political turmoil in Italy at the time, and her father was really good at kind of staying out of trouble with it. And so obviously her parents were really shrewd, and I think she was really shrewd. And one of the things that happened when she was a young woman, is that she was rejected from certain orders. She wanted to be a nun very, very much, and she was rejected a couple times because people in positions of authority saw her as a really good teacher. So she was very smart and very, had access to the wider world early on in her life. She was very practical. She was a good negotiator. She knew how to recognize men who were trying to cheat her. And there was one story of where a very wealthy man gave her a promise that he was going to give her a bunch of money, and he did hand over the money. And he had some people he owed money to who wanted to kind of grab it away from her and her her missionary sisters before they could do anything with it. And she knew very well what they were doing. So she went and bought land with it, like immediately, so that there was no way that these other guys could take the money away from her. So she was really good at wheeling and dealing for property and for, getting donations. But don't forget, she was totally inspired by the Holy Spirit. She was working for the betterment of poor people. She was trying to keep families together. She was doing this for the Catholic cause. So that's hard to fight with when someone is so fiercely passionate about what they want to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you kind of open the book with one of the stories of where they're like, "What are these nuns doing out here?" And she's like, "We're measuring the property because we don't trust the people we're buying it from." That
That's
really
right.
kind of sets up okay, she's a tough cookie.
Mm-hmm.
And she was often seemed to build schools, orphanages, hospitals out of sheer will. I mean, she just would show up someplace and she had nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but she managed, and part of that is because she was an incredible fundraiser.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how did she go about that?
Well, she was able to identify rich people really easily, and she could hang out with them easily. So on the ocean voyages, when she was going back and forth from, say, the United States back to Europe, or from the United States to Central or South America, there were a lot of rich people, first-class people on these boats, and she would just go sit with them, and she'd start talking about her work, and she'd start talking about the poor orphans. And before she knew it, they were writing checks to her. Um, and I also think that, that was at one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, all the young women who came into her order had to learn skills. They had to learn how to sew. They had to learn how to do embroidery. And it's funny because a lot of them were already teachers, and she had them doing nursing jobs. Like they would just switch from being a teacher to a nurse with no training, because she knew that they were going to have to do this, that they had to make money somehow. They would have to use their skills, sell their embroidery, become seamstresses. So that was at one end. So she wanted all the sisters to be skilled in some way, but she also went to these very, very wealthy people. And she was connected to Cesnola, who is a big, wealthy Italian man who'd settled in New York, who actually became the first director of the Metropolitan Museum. And she and his wife became very good friends and started an orphanage. His wife funded it. So she was able to move in different levels of society and very comfortably, and get an appeal to wealthy people to give her money. She was just really good at that.
And that is a skill set. As somebody who works in fundraising, Yeah, I mean, that whole one, establishing that one-on-one relationship is really pretty critical. I also like the fact that if people didn't kind of pay up like they said they would, she would, you know, give them a little reminder, you know, showing up in her habit with her blue eyes going, no, 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 you told
Well,
me.
I was just reading today. I was kind of refreshing my memory, and there's an actual quote of her saying to one of these very wealthy men, "If you don't pay me, you're going to encounter real trouble." I mean, and the implication was God was going to get this guy, you know, if he didn't pay her. I guess it worked, you know.
See, that means something totally different after we've all watched several seasons of The Sopranos. Um, let's see. One of the things I thought was interesting was the fact that some of the places she went, you know, I think there's, especially for those of us who live in New Jersey, New York metropolitan area, there's sort of like this idea of this is where, you know, immigrants came, but immigrants went all over the country, and she did as well. In fact, she had quite encountered quite some difficulty in New Orleans, which is a city that I think people associate with French people and Spanish people, but not Italian people.
Yes, she went to Chicago and Denver and Seattle and New Orleans and Burbank, you know, out here. She was in Los Angeles. Um, but New Orleans was a real interesting place for me to learn about in during her time because there was a lot of yellow fever, and Italian immigrants were working at the docks, and they didn't know at the time that the mosquitoes were all around the produce that was being unloaded from the docks. So they were coming down with terrible cases of yellow fever. But also wherever Italians went, and they went to all these different cities, and they also went to the countryside to try and establish farms. They were discriminated against very harshly. And in New Orleans, there was an incident that I'd never known about before, which was about 13 Sicilians were accused of killing a sheriff, and a jury found them not guilty. But before they could be released from the jail, a mob came and opened up the doors and chased them down and caught three of them and lynched them. And it went all over the news. It was 1891, I believe, and it went all over the news in the United States. And immigrants, but especially Italians, this was traumatizing. It made them feel incredibly unsafe. It made them feel like they couldn't trust people around them, and they had to watch out for themselves. And you know, this deeply hurt Mother Cabrini, and she realized that her people were suffering from this. And so she went to New Orleans, and she also took her sisters there, and they worked among the people who were sick from yellow fever. And she just wanted to be there with them and just kind of reassure them. And this is why her faith and her bringing sort of the Catholic traditions to these communities was so important, because she wanted to reassure them. She wanted them to feel like they were home. She wanted the families to be stronger and support each other, and communities to support each other. And she really worked hard at that. It was, you know, just really smart. You know, she really understood how to sort of support communities at that time. And you know, it was very difficult for Italian immigrants wherever they went.
I know that you do give this figure in the book near the end, but can you share with our audience, by the time she died in 1917, how many different missions, churches, hospitals, or not churches, but orders, hospitals, schools had she founded?
Well, the number is 67. And when you think about it, it's kind of incredible, because for the most part, she had to start with nothing. And I followed the stories of a couple of the hospitals that she started in New York, and she really started them with the idea of getting Italian doctors and Italian speaking nurses and staff to come so that Italians would feel comfortable going to them, where they knew that somebody would understand them when they said why they were sick or where they were hurting, which was really, really smart. And she pulled in doctors from all over the place and did this. Of course, just like anything else, she had to raise money for these hospitals. And so some of these hospitals exist today. And the name Cabrini is very common in urban areas, schools, hospitals. I don't know about orphanages, but when you think about orphanages, there were children, there weren't federal agencies at that time that took care of orphans, so basically it was nuns. It was like people like her who would do the social work that was so desperately needed for poor people. And there were orphans in every city, of course. And so she started orphanages and, had her missionary sisters teach them and care for them and take them on little trips and make sure that they learned little skills that they could use to make money. And it was just incredible when you think about it. And 67 is a very big number when you think that she was like a one-woman operation. She didn't have a lot of funding behind her each time she wanted to start one of these places.
Well, maybe she was better at it because of the lack of bureaucracy. I mean, I can't imagine anybody founding 67 of anything by themselves. Like, I can't imagine one person building 67 Starbucks. So it's really it really blows my mind what she was able to do. And her just sheer determination. And the other thing too with the orphans is what really struck me was, she herself felt, but she taught the sisters in her order to be kind to these children at a time when, some people were like, children are, seen but not heard, or, there wasn't any kind of concept of child psychology, like maybe a child was misbehaving because of something, but she had that compassion towards children, and she instilled it into her order, which I think had a
Yeah,
big effect.
totally. And I think that goes, to her upbringing. Her parents were very kind and, very, they were country people basically, but they were very kind, and also her faith. And also one of the keys to her success is she did become friendly with the Pope. And I think when you go around and people know that the Pope has kind of given his blessing, that she had an extra power to do things, that he liked her, she liked him, they met a bunch of times. And I think that helped, that opened a lot of doors for her. And I think her training as a teacher helped her to be really good with children. And she had real intuition about what they needed, and especially girls, which just made me think like she must have seen the tragedy of what happens to girls who are poor, who have nothing to offer. They probably fell into really horrible situations. And she recognized, because she had a little education, that would help. And she knew how to do embroidery and sell it, and that helped. And so she had a real commitment to kind of lifting poor people up just a little bit so that they could get a footing in the world.
Wow, I wonder if you could authenticate it, what a piece of Mother Cabrini embroidery would bring to the like, I want to see that on Show Up at an Antiques Roadshow.
Yes, I'm sure it will sometime.
What do you think, and you've touched on this, but what do you really think her legacy is today? You mentioned there are still schools and hospitals in operation that she founded. So what is her legacy?
I'd say, really the people to answer that question would be Catholics, because Catholics really she has quite a following. And I'm not Catholic, I was not raised Catholic, but I've encountered this passion about her. And I'm not sure whether it's because of, she is called the Patron Saint of Immigrants, and it could be that that's it. I mean, all of us are basically immigrants. And maybe people feel like she went the distance for immigrants where very few people did. She wanted to protect immigrants when people didn't care whether they lived or died. She wanted to rescue them from disease and death and discrimination when nobody else did. I think that might be the reason why she's so popular. And also just her stalwart faith. I mean, she was unshakable in her faith. And that's really attractive. And I think it's really rare in this day and age that people are driven by their faith to do such huge things for the world. That's my guess. And like I said, every city you go to, there, I mean, there's a Cabrini University, there's Cabrini, there's Cabrini Green in Chicago. Not all of them were started by her, but she's inspired their efforts, and her name is used quite a bit. So you'd have to ask Catholics, I would say, for the real answer.
Well, yes, she's a saint, so that does also elevate her to a certain extent. Although, as you and I said, I thought she was ready for sainthood before she even left this sphere. She was such an amazing woman. And I think one of the things too that's interesting is some of these places, you know, she said she went to Italians, and we mentioned New Orleans, and she went to Denver, but she also went to countries in South America,
Mhm.
which again is not something you think of. And they had some real trouble in some of those I mean, they literally got chased from one to the other.
True. I mean, she stepped into political situations that she didn't even really know much about. And again, there were wealthy people down there who wanted her to build schools and build orphanages. But there were conflicts there that she inadvertently stepped in the middle of, and she had to leave sometimes really quickly. But she also had friends there who had established places already, and that's how she went from, you know, across the Andes, and on the other side she found Buenos Aires and found people that she knew there. So uh, I mean, it is incredible when you think about it. And there were diseases down there too, in the jungle and the tropics. She was not prepared for that, and tremendous heat and difficulty. Um, it's just mind-boggling to think of her going, you know, by foot, by mule, by train, you know, these old trains chugging up the side of the mountain, you know, full of peril, really.
Yeah, and I mean, somebody who was not healthy. It was ultimately malaria that really weakened her health at the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, she had respiratory problems from the get-go. So that's one reason why she liked Southern California, is the weather was really nice for her respiratory problems. But yes, she got malaria, and it's funny, you know, I guess, you know, maybe this is more well known, but she always went with a companion. Like, all these nuns were always supposed to travel with somebody else, never by themselves. So sometimes she was going with companions who were not up for this kind of rugged travel, and they
No,
got.
no, that woman went over the Andes with, you know.
No, I mean, that story of her jumping over the crevasse was, you know, not, I didn't make that up. That really happened. She jumped over a crevasse and almost slipped into it. I mean, wouldn't you turn around and say, no, never mind, I'm not going to go over that?
Absolutely. It actually, it's funny. It's not really the same, but it did kind of make me think of Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants. It just seemed that same kind of level of like, what were you thinking? And actually, we have a someone with us who said she was a badass, quote unquote, and I'm a
Ah.
Catholic.
Okay. Mhm.
I think badass is a good way to, you know,
I
describe
would
her.
say so. Yes, I would agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to open it up to questions now. We've got one, but please, you know, feel free to ask some more. Um, Carol has asked, and this is a great question. This is actually something I wondered when I was reading the book, is where did she get the money to pay for the ocean voyages and then the stamps for all the letters she wrote?
Ah, well, I don't know for sure, but I know that there was some funding that came from the Catholic Church. So people, even though some of her immediate superiors resented her independence, like I said, the Pope was in favor of her work and in favor of her personally. And I think that the Pope agreed to fund some of her big adventures because he saw her fervor as a missionary, and that she was, she was going to come back to him again and again and again for permission to do what she wanted. So I believe that the Catholic Church did pay for some of the trips. I don't, that specific information, I don't know, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, that would make sense. Or maybe a wealthy person in one town would help pay for her to get to the next place.
Possibly,
Um,
truly.
Linda asks, where did you get most of your history and your documentation to write your book?
Most of the history came from the book I was telling you about. It was actually originally written in Italy, but was then translated into English. And it was written by her secretary who was her secretary, I think, in the last 10 years of her life. That woman's name was Severio de Maria. And she was a nun also, of course. And that's considered the definitive biography. And like I said, it was written first in Italian, but it's since been translated, and I relied on that. And then I have this book of her journals from her ocean voyages. It's a whole entire book of her writings. And then another one that was by a woman named Mary Louise Sullivan, who is also in that order. And she has a PhD, and she's a historian, and she wrote a very thorough book called Mother Cabrini, Italian Immigrant of the Century. And she also gave tremendous sources and she dug up a lot of old pictures of some of the early places in New York. So those are the top 3 books, but I had some other ones too.
I'd like to read her ocean voyage one.
Mm-hmm.
Then, because I'm a nerd like that, I'd like to match up with, see what ship she was on.
Oh, yes. And that one is called To the Ends of the Earth, The Missionary Travels of Francis X. Cabrini.
Sounds really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So Sally asks, since she traveled so much, do you know how many languages she spoke?
Ah, gosh, I did at one point, and I can't remember now. I'm sorry, I don't. I know, I mean, obviously she learned English and she knew Italian, and because she was a European, I'm pretty sure she knew French as well, but I don't know for sure. I don't know
She
for sure.
preferred Italian, I think you talk about in her book.
Yeah, I mean, she had people around her who spoke other languages, so I think she had translators when she needed them.
Linda asks, did her parents live long enough to see her successes?
No, her parents died right after she became a teacher. So she was really young, and her parents had, I think, 13 children, but only 3 of them survived. And Mother Cabrini had two sisters and a brother, and their parents died when they were all fairly young. One of her sisters was mentally challenged, and her other sister had to take care of her. I think her brother became a farmer for a bit. I don't remember, but no, sadly, they didn't live long enough. I don't think people lived very long back then, and especially if they were farmers.
Yeah, and I remember from the book you said her mother really took the loss of those children very, very hard.
Yeah, I mean, naturally so. I think she became depressed, and it's traumatic, traumatic deaths for her. The other thing I wanted to just mention is the other 2 books that I really liked a lot were, I mentioned How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, but also Strangers in the Land, which is Patterns of American Nativism, which was written in the 50s, and it was about how Americans have always disliked and mistrusted immigrants, and how they used to enact all kinds of weird laws to keep immigrants from getting ahead in society or in their professions. For a while, there was a law that no immigrant could become a doctor, or no immigrant could become a lawyer. And so it's really kind of part of the American history that we are a land of immigrants, but who's ever been here longest discriminates against the next generation of immigrants. And that was a really interesting book, Strangers in the Land.
Okay, I think we have one last comment from Frank. Ms. Gregory, it's a pleasure to listen to you describe it all. Thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Oh, you're quite welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right, I'll look for a second. I'm going to stare at the chat and see if anything else appears. But you've all had some really great questions, because especially that how did she afford to travel one, that I wondered as well. Because it was a lot. I mean, it took people, poor people, a lot of time and effort to be able to save up to. I mean, I know even my mother is an immigrant from Scotland, and I know my grandfather emigrated first, and worked, and then my grandmother worked back in Scotland in order to. So I mean, that was still happening in the mid 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all right, we've gotten a lot of compliments, so I would just like to close by saying, on behalf of everyone at Save Ellis Island, thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us. Copies of the book are available on Save Ellis Island's website, www.saveellisisland.org. It's really a great read, and we hope that you will join us for our next event, April 27th, when Susan Meissner, one of our favorites, is with us to discuss her brand new book, Only the Beautiful. Visit our website to register and check out other upcoming events. We'll have a few more author series coming up. And again, visit www.saveellisisland.org to become a member, learn more about the work that we do and ways that you can help preserve this site. And if you haven't been, if you're in the New York metropolitan area, Ellis Island and the Hard Hat Tour on Ellis Island should be pretty near the top of your list, because it's not like anything else you're going to experience in New York City, and it's a great part of American history that I'm always learning about, and I work with it, so check it out. Thanks so much, Nicole.
You're welcome.
Good
Bye,
night,
everybody.
everybody.